Can you hear me? The music. Okay, all right. So yes, maybe reiterate that last very important piece. This lecture today is featuring Professor Emeritus Stephen Aschheim, the Vigevani Chair of European Studies and the Director of the Franz Rosenzweig Research Center for German Literature and Cultural History at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And as respondent, we will have Professor Victoria de Grazia, the more collegiate Professor Emerita of History here at Columbia. Andreas Hüssen, whom I believe many of you know very well here as the Willard Professor Emeritus of German and Comparative Literature, also at Columbia, will introduce them in a moment, as well as very briefly introduce the historian George Mosse, whose legacy these lectures are endowed to honor. And Mosse will be introduced only very briefly by Andreas because he is also the topic of the lecture tonight. Are we having interferences again? So the topic of the lecture today is George Mosse, historian of fascism, masculinity, and nationalism. It is only fitting that the first of these annual lectures here at Columbia should honor the memory of the scholar in whose name they are given. Future lectures will turn to pressing contemporary political, social, and cultural issues to be addressed in cross-disciplinary and transnational perspectives by scholars, public intellectuals, artists, or writers. Although, given the rise of fascism in our own contemporary moment, perhaps the implied distinction between historiographic perspectives on the one hand and current affairs on the others is less than solid. What could be more pressing than talking about the analysis of fascism today? In any case, my job here really are only the thank yous. Again, first and foremost, without musical interference, to Roger Strauch and the Mosse Foundation in Wisconsin. But I'm also grateful to a number of co-sponsoring units here on campus who helped us get out the word and come together as a community for this occasion, namely the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, the University Seminar on Cultural Memory, the Society of Fellows, and the Heyman Center for the Humanities, and the European Institute. And then I would also in particular like to thank, as always, but really with emphasis on this occasion, Shireen Alexander and Kerstin Hoffman, who made it all possible from the administrative angle, as well as Ryan on the tech. And it's been a long planning process. And finally, last not least, I would like to thank Andreas himself, without whom all of this would not have to come together here at Columbia. So let me just hand this over to Andreas Hüssen now.
Welcome. Great to see you all. Now, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Stephen Aschheim and Vicky de Grazia, both of whom are long-term friends and compagnons de route. Stephen is, of course, as you know, a major intellectual historian and cultural historian whose life work revolves around the legacies of German Jewish culture in the 19th and 20th centuries. Having been a student of George Mosse's at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in the 1960s, and having carried on Mosse's legacies in critical and expanded form, he was our immediate choice to introduce this first annual Mosse Lecture at Columbia. But let me first add, before I say more about him and the respondent, let me add my personal thanks to Roger Strauch and the Mosse Foundation, and also welcome special guest Skye Doney. Where are you? Here, Skye Doney, who is the director of the George Mosse program in history at UW-Madison in Wisconsin. Now, I will not yield to the temptation to speak about George Mosse, whom I knew quite well in my time as assistant professor in Wisconsin, except to say this: his work on the historical roots of Nazi culture, yes, you heard right, Nazi culture, a term that would have raised many eyebrows among historians at that time. His work was path-breaking and formative for a whole generation of young Germanists in literature and in history. It helped reorient the field of German literary and cultural studies in the United States, which took many of its cues from the annual Wisconsin workshop, in which Mosse's voice was as central as that of his colleagues in literature. I should add here as a footnote that Stephen Aschheim taught here in one semester as a distinguished Max Kase visiting professor in 2005. He taught a wonderful seminar. I remember the students' glowing reports, but neither of us remembers what the topic was. So it's a pleasure to have you back here, Stephen. Now, among Stephen's many books, I'd single out the early and influential Brothers and Strangers, the East European Jew in German and German Jewish Consciousness, 1800 to 1923, published in 1982. The book offered a cogent discourse analysis, as we'd call it now, of the historical emergence of the rift between Eastern and Western Jews, German Jews, and Ostjuden, the creation of cultural symbols, perceptions, and visual images that were to prove central in the anti-Semitic Völkisch ideology of the Nazis. Then after that, a big tome, The Nietzsche Legacy in Germany, 1890 to 1990, published in 1992, which explored the conflictual reception of Nietzsche between right and left, fascists, socialists, and liberals. This book was followed by Culture and Catastrophe, German and Jewish confrontations with National Socialism and other crises, published in 1996, which focused on the indissoluble dialectic between culture and catastrophe, a by now standard trope characterizing not just National Socialism, but in some accounts, the 20th century at large. Many more books followed, with rich and illuminating essays on key problems of German modernity, the Sonderweg thesis, totalitarianism, the historiography of the Shoah, and practically on every German Jewish major intellectual of the 20th century, such as Gershom Scholem, Martin Buber, Ernst Cassirer, Avi Warburg, Leo Strauss, Franz Rosenzweig, Viktor Klemperer, Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt, John Amery, and of course, last but not least, George Mosse. And I left many out. Stephen's most recent book, Fragile Spaces, Forays into Jewish Memory, European History, and Complex Identities, appeared in 2018, so he is still very much at it. Compelling writing throughout, deep historical knowledge, commitment to an Enlightenment tradition, and sober and succinct analysis characterizes all of Stephen's work, which is also always, I should add, a pleasure to read. So glad to have you with us again. Responding to the lecture will be Victoria de Grazia, who has taught at Columbia since 1994. She's a leading scholar of Italian fascism with books such as The Culture of Consent, Mass Organization of Leisure in Fascist Italy, 1981, and How Fascism Ruled Women, Italy, 1922 to 1945, published 11 years later. Books that were followed by Irresistible Empire, America's Advance through 20th Century Europe, published in 2005. A magisterial and irresistible analysis of how American-style marketing, mass distribution, and Hollywood mass entertainment invaded Europe in the interwar years, breaking down traditional patterns of consumption and of class distinction. Her most recent book, however, is the prize-winning The Perfect Fascist, a story of love, power, and morality in Mussolini's Italy, a compelling page-turner that illuminates the history of fascist Italy through the story of Mussolini's most loyal soldier and strong man, Attilio Teruzzi, minister of colonial Italian Africa and leader of the Black Shirts, husband to the Jewish-American opera diva Liliana Weinmann, he could not divorce, partnered with a Romanian-born Jewish woman he could not marry, and by 1938, father to a Jewish daughter he could not legally recognize. Reading about this perfect fascist's political and familiar trajectory and operatic tribulations, I wondered how George Mosse would have described the perfect Nazi in the German context of love, power, and morality, and some other things one would probably have to add here. Anyway, perhaps we should leave this question for the discussion period if we like. So please welcome with me Stephen Aschheim and Vicky de Grazia.
Well, one does have to start with thanks, but in this case, it's actually very genuine. So I'll very, very briefly thank, first of all, the members of the German department, from Claudia Reger, Shireen Alexander. I can't see her, but she tolerated my bumblings and maneuvers for months, and Kirsten. Sky Doney, who is the director of the Madison Mosse program. But above all, not above all, but certainly central, is this fellow, Andreas Hussen, whose generous introduction was perhaps exaggerated, but his generosity and his warmth and his care is obvious to everyone, especially because once in 2005, he did the most outstanding and perhaps crazy act. He actually came to fetch me at the Newark airport. So this tells you something about Andreas, apart from the quality of his scholarship. So I'll get straight to it. Obviously, it is an honor to open the series, but those who are perhaps unfamiliar with George Lachmann Mosse, his biography is as interesting as his work. And obviously, his biography and his work are deeply interconnected. He was born in 1919 into what can only be called the wealthy German Jewish elite, the Mosse Lachmann family, which was famed for its art collection, its encouragement of culture, and its philanthropy. And they were, of course, owners of a highly influential publishing empire and the leading liberal German newspaper, the Berliner Tageblatt. During the Weimar Republic, they were constantly attacked by the Nazis, and just upon the takeover of power, the young George, in perhaps his lifelong characteristic madcap fashion, managed to leave Germany at the very last possible moment. For he was both, he later described himself, by the way, as a permanent exile. There's a book called Ich bleibe Emigrant, which was only half true, for he was both an outsider, a sensitivity that we will see was very closely tied to his work, but also a revered member of the communities to which he belonged. He spent his academic life restlessly traversing the world, yet he was also very much at home in Madison. As George was a pioneering historian, we also have, and Andreas pointed this out to me, a New York connection with his sister Hilda, who did pioneering psychiatric work with children in Harlem. But let me now try to give the measure of the historian George Mosse. George, as those who knew him almost always addressed him, he thought, spoke, and wrote prodigiously, pioneeringly, and almost always provocatively. If you want to know what a Mossian is, it's provocation. While not neglecting high culture, and indeed himself kind of incarnating the enlightened Bildungskultur, he himself incarnated, was his role in literally part of redefining what intellectual and cultural history is about. He consciously departed from the somewhat elitist and rarefied Hegelian tradition of Ideengeschichte, with its inbuilt bias towards abstraction and a progressive Hegelian rationality, and turned to subjects like popular literature, myths and symbols, ideologies of irrationalism, youth movements, muscle building gymnastics, nose straightening surgery. Don't look at mine. More than anything else, he uncovered the crucial role of normative stereotypes and their excluding mechanisms. His specialized studies covered a wide range of topics and subject matter. I won't turn to them, but his early career, as he himself said, I first had to assimilate into American culture before I could really turn to what most existentially is important to me. And so he has a series of works on Christianity, on Christian casuistry, on reason of state, until one day a colleague came up to him and said to him, "George, you're such an interesting person. Why are your books so boring?" And it's at that point, after 2 decades in the United States, that he turned to what was his life indeed. So his life and his writings are very deeply interconnected. From that time on, a virtual flood of works ensued on folkish ideology, fascism, Nazism, the Holocaust, German history, Jewish history, Zionism, anti-Semitism, on monuments, secular religion and mass politics, on liberalism and socialism, and the role of intellectuals in politics, on war, shell shock and processes of civic brutalization, on memory and modes of commemoration, on medicine, nervousness, and degenerative masturbation. When he came to the Hebrew University and the historians there heard he was talking about masturbation, there was absolute crisis in the department. On racism, aesthetics, and visual culture, on bourgeois respectability, on masculinity, on androgynes, which today we go by another name, transsexuality. He was writing about them very early on, and of course, sexuality and nationalism. These are varied topics, obviously, but they possess a certain unity, linked, I think, by a critical concern with processes of inclusion and exclusion, with ideal and antitypes, with straitjacketing definitions of normalcy and abnormalcy, which was always propelled by a certain Enlightenment belief in the autonomy of the individual, the expansion of humanizing experience, and his concern with its defeat by mass forces of homogenization. He brought to his work a commitment and passion which he said was really decreasing amongst his colleagues, in which he said, "Oh, I always had this accent, oh, so many of my colleagues should have been accountants," is what he said. As a German Jewish emigre, and at first an undeclared homosexual, later he declared, who had himself experienced rejection and exclusion firsthand, there's little doubt that his evolving work had both generational and autobiographical roots. It is telling that although he regarded his forced leaving of Germany in 1933 as a form of liberation, a way of saying, I'm getting away from the constrictions of this elite family, that he did say, ultimately, towards the end, he did define himself, I quote, as a member of the Holocaust generation. In all his works, he never really went into anything like the mechanics of the Holocaust, the details which he would have dismissed, I think, as merely technical in nature. What he did do was probe the multitude of deeper lying cultural, ideological, and political building blocks that rendered the event conceivable, that made it thinkable in the first place, something which most historians did not deal with. His position on this was very radical, probably very questionable today. I'm quoting, all my books, he says, in one way or another have dealt with the Jewish catastrophe of my time, which I always regarded as no accident, structural fault, or continuity of bureaucratic habits, but which is built into our society and towards our life. Nothing in European history is a stranger to the Holocaust. And I've tried to delve ever more deeply into the nature of European society through analyzing its perception of and attitudes to the outsider. That can be disputed. Typically, he also insisted on what I would call de-ghettoizing Jewish history. He rejected the common, and this certainly was true in Jerusalem, a common kind of ethnocentric bias that by definition had to kind of follow its own unique narrative and laws, immanent laws. To some extent, certain critics have said, Mosse's view of Jewish history was that of the German Jewish elite. It was from above. It wasn't part of the experience of the masses. It was part of the wealthy Berlin Jewish elite. After all, who else could write a paean of praise with the title German Jews Beyond Judaism? So this is not the typical food that you would think of regular Jewish historians. At any rate, by linking Jewish faith to central currents of the European experience, he connected dimensions that very often remain separate and compartmentalized. Clearly, The Crisis of German Ideology, which is the book that really formed his entrance into the modern period, over the years, his canvas became broader. There was an evolution of thought and evolution of perspective. His work now became implicitly intertwined with an emerging acknowledgement of his own minority homosexual status. While Jewish victimization remained central, even unique, the scope of analysis became ever more broader. Jews as victims formed part of a continuum and a dynamic affecting other victims, their status and stereotypes comprehensible only alongside other outsiders. Now, I'm going to start here by saying that broader canvas hides other significant shifts. In order to understand this, we must first examine the Crisis book. By the way, I say the Crisis book, for those who didn't know George, if he was writing about sexuality, he'd say, oh, I'm writing the sex book. Oh, I'm writing the war book, or I'm writing the Crisis book. So in the Crisis book, it treated us to an erudite, richly detailed display of how folkish ideology, that semi-mystic organic Weltanschauung, with its metaphysic of eternal national rootedness, its symbolism of blood and soil, its anti-liberal, anti-urban bias, penetrated German culture and politics, and by focusing upon the Jewish stereotype of rootlessness and alienness, how that became intertwined or integrated into the Nazi anti-Jewish revolution. Yet original as it was, and it was, there was a competitor, by the way, whose name perhaps I should mention, seeing that we're at Columbia. His name was Fritz Stern, who, when the Crisis came out, The Politics of Cultural Despair, was not dissimilar in nature. And anyway, the Crisis book nevertheless fitted a conventional Sonderweg paradigm of the time. German developments, he argued, towards modernity were singular and differed fundamentally from the liberal democratic West, its anti-modernity repudiating the rational European Enlightenment and the social radicalism of the French Revolution. But as he proceeded, George subtly softened the Sonderweg Germanocentric explanation and moved far more to a wider European canvas. So his 1975 nationalization of the masses made it clear that ultimately fascism and Nazism were part of the broadest defining developments of political modernity, incomprehensible outside of the European-wide backdrop of the fusion of democracy and nationalism and the creation of a new mobilizing liturgical politics, visually oriented, participatory, counter to liberal parliamentarism, rendering even the French Revolution as partly complicit in the rise of fascism. His 1978 Towards the Final Solution, it is true, rendered Jews as its central victims, but it is also not just a history of German racism, but a wider history of European racism. There, the world is divided into normative types and antitypes, and there is a major subtle role of aesthetics, not science, as the standards of racist judgments, rooted in the ubiquitous ideal of Greek beauty. Racists employed an aesthetic physiognomy predicated on making judgments not only about external appearance, but crucially about inner moral qualities. These were European-wide stereotypes and clearly not limited to Jews, just as no one could claim a Greek heritage for the hunched, ugly stereotype of the ghetto Jew. This was equally true for the thick lips, crinkly hair, and flat nose of the quote unquote Negro. I know one is not allowed to use it without the quotes. If Jewish looks validated an inherent criminality and manipulativeness, Black deportment confirmed an essential inner violence and primitiveness. And these widening European perspectives are equally apparent in his 1990 Fallen Soldiers. There it is World War I, with its well-nigh universal 20th century experience of mass death that takes center stage. In that context, not folkish tradition, not ingrained racism, but the later militant right-wing appropriation of the brutalized war experience, which was transposed into civil politics, became paramount. But his most radical turn was not just the simple enlargement of the historical canvas that took in most of Europe and went beyond Germany. It concerns his portrait of the role of the middle class in all of these developments. Although in the Crisis of German Ideology, he did suggest that through anti-Semitism, the bourgeoisie was integrated into the Nazi revolution, the determinative role of the middle classes was only very minimally outlined. But in his 1985 Nationalism and Sexuality and 1996 The Image of Man, the modern bourgeoisie, at least in some of its guises, becomes an essential expression of the intolerant fascist and Nazi impulses. From the late 18th century on, Mosse argued, nationalism and middle-class morality entered into a powerful alliance, defining modern standards of sexual behavior and other modes of respectable conduct in such a way that an ever-tightening distinction between normality and abnormality was developed and enforced. Manliness now became part of normal and normative national and bourgeois self-definition. This alliance, he wrote, became increasingly totalized, insisting on assigning everyone a fixed place. There were the healthy. If you have the healthy, then you have to have the degenerate. If you have virile, self-controlled men, you have to have nervous, effeminate homosexuals. If you have sane people, you have to have insane people. And the energetically productive as opposed to the lazy. And of course, the settled native and the rootless foreigner. This rigid code, cloaked under the guise of respectability and what was called in German Sittlichkeit, was invoked to control the reality that the alliance had itself created. Bourgeois society, he wrote, needs its dialectical opposite in order to exist. And it is there that the critique of respectability becomes subversively and conceptually central. For Mosse, Nazism was not about a peculiar German Sonderweg, or even a radical Nietzschean nihilism, or even the Noltean revolt against bourgeois transcendence, but rather about corrupted and threatened middle-class men attempting to maintain the apparent values of healthy manliness, orderliness, cleanliness, hard work, and family life against those outsider groups who in their eyes seem morally, bodily, and aesthetically diseased and degenerate, and who dangerously desecrated the basic tenets of bourgeois respectability. I quote, "The new man of National Socialism," he wrote, "was the ideal bourgeois, and it was their antitypes, the sexual deviants, gypsies, Jews, permanently insane people whom Hitler wanted to exterminate and whom he did exterminate. They all seemed alike. They all looked the opposite of the middle-class, self-controlled idea of beauty, energy, and productivity." Now, parenthetically, we are allowed to have a certain criticism of the man we're celebrating. So parenthetically, what I would argue here, that this was a brilliant Mossian provocation. He was surely aware that Nazi perpetrators understood the highly transgressive, taboo-breaking, that is highly un-bourgeois nature of their acts. He would agree, I believe, that Nazism combined both bourgeois and anti-bourgeois elements. And it was precisely in the combination and tension between these elements, in the fusion of the conventional and the extraordinary, that Nazism transcended middle-class morality at the same time that it embodied it. Indeed, as George demonstrated in The Image of Man, middle-class morality and respectability doesn't necessarily have to be genocidal. I mean, you are a middle-class audience. You're sitting there very politely. You may be bored, but you're sitting here as good bourgeoisie listening. So when he understood this, that middle-class respectability was clearly a deeply necessary and ingrained part of our lives. In fact, what he showed that we continue, although less and less so, and that's a good thing, to have definitions of what constitutes normality and abnormality. The book ends with a chapter called Everyone's Morality. That is to say, if you wanted to really find bourgeois morality, it would be in the Bolshevik state. It was in Russia. So we've looked at some of his most pointed negative critiques. What about his more positive commitments? What he called his points of redemption of the human spirit. He was clearly a liberal who believed deeply in the autonomy of the individual and personalizing relationships. More specifically, he constantly emphasized that these values were most clearly incarnated in the specific notion of Bildung, that untranslatable classical German idea of ethical and cultural development through self-cultivation. If for Mosse, respectability represents narrowness, constrictiveness, the contraction of tolerance and possibilities, for him, Bildung embodied the ideal of openness, the expansion of human experience. Tolerance, cultured self-cultivation, and the autonomy of the individual were its trademarks. And implicitly, he applied these as the moral measure to all his works. Yet once again, a very autobiographical impulse emerges, for he rendered the ethical history of Bildung, which is a general thing, into virtually a specific ethnic Jewish property. His 1985 German Jews Beyond Judaism is an analysis of the historical process whereby German Jews slowly became virtually the sole carriers of that humanizing sensibility. Witness to the desertion by the non-Jewish German educated middle class of a doctrine they had originally shared with the emancipated Jewish co-citizens. Indeed, for George, the German Jewish heritage is the heritage of Bildung, which itself became a kind of new Jewish tradition, a defining ingredient of their post-emancipation identity. For this was an idea that seemed tailor-made for their needs to emancipate, because, as he put it, hello, it's the doorbell. Very insistent doorbell. Where was I? Yeah, it was an ideal made for integration because it transcended all differences of nationality and religion through the unfolding of the individual personality. And this, he argued, became woven into the very fabric of German Jewish being. German Jews Beyond Judaism, by the way, is the work in which, as he himself admitted, is my most personal book, almost a confession of faith. But he was a responsible and critical historian, and he characteristically retained a certain critical perspective on Bildung itself. Given their almost automatic belief in the primacy of culture over politics, Bildungsjews, he wrote, entirely misread their own situation and deluded themselves by projecting their own ethical ideals onto a Germany that already possessed a quite different reality. Indeed, as he argued, while Jews were emancipated into the promises of Bildung, they were also taught to adjust to the norms of respectability. Eventually, they became caught in a vice when Bildung became a nationalized rather than an individual value. It was very easy to stereotypically represent gesticulating, manipulating, nervous Jews as the antithesis of respectability. In all these ways, Mosse became perhaps the most important contemporary historian of the manifold strategies of inclusion and exclusion, belonging and displacement, disdained outsiders and normative insiders. This was a conception of culture determined by a dialectical relationship between the center and the periphery. The insider acquires identity and defines himself or herself in terms of the outsider that they create. Moreover, these processes were always located within what he used to call a fully furnished house. Despite his own liberalism, history for him was a totality. The political cannot be separated from the religious, the science from the aesthetics, the mythological from the rational. Clearly then, he wasn't interested in history as a dry narrative, but in the big questions and possible answers. He was no positivist and certainly not a plodding antiquarian. Indeed, sometimes he could be completely cavalier with his facts and his stories. Walter Laqueur tells the story about George telling him that he was entertained in his home in 1919 by Edith Piaf, when in fact Edith Piaf was 5 years old at the time. But that didn't worry George. He said, but that's not the point. And he was quite correct. It really wasn't the point. But anyway, as just one instance, his general portrait of Bildung and his idealized portrait of German Jews has without doubt received criticism from a whole variety of perspectives, that I won't go into them now. In fact, I'm one of the people who wrote a criticism. And what stood out for George is his delight at being critiqued. And that is to say, first of all, the understanding that somebody took his work seriously, and that's part of the work of a historian is the critical role. So in effect, in that sense, he was quite, if you like, unique. but he was a deeply complex man, and like all of us, I assume, full of conflicts and contradictions. And it's precisely these conflicts and contradictions, which I hope is true for most of us, that render the work so energetic and compulsive. So, who better to detail the dialectics between nervousness and self-control than George? Anyone who knew George is that his leg was always moving, always moving. But he yielded insights from that, which were extremely relevant. So I want to, I'm going to try and be as quick as I can now. We're waiting to hear from Vicky. His writing his history was precisely because it was galvanized by his own autobiography. So I'm going to give two examples. The first and the most obvious is apparent in his work on sexuality. Existential roots and his own gayness, he acknowledged, were behind his concern with bourgeois respectability and its construction of normal and abnormal categories of sexuality. As he put it, he had engaged with the specific outsiderisms of which I have been a member. Yet even though in the Crisis book he was the first to discuss male eros as part of folkish thought, he only explicitly addressed homosexuality in the latter part of his life. Indeed, with extraordinary candor, he even claimed that perhaps these later works failed to suppress sufficiently my anger over the fact that the strictures of respectability had made my own life so much more difficult. And as I mentioned before, although he never used the word transsexual, very early on, he was writing, amongst other things in his works on sexuality, about trans people and androgynes and hermaphrodites. For all that, he never allowed his analysis to become embittered or simplistic or politically correct. That is because at the same time that he critiqued respectability, he not only personally internalized it, but he understood its very necessity. If he advocated the expansion of boundaries and pressed for greater tolerance of minorities and sexual outsiders, he also understood the limits of such expansion. Perhaps one could permit greater latitude of sexual expression, a relaxation of over-repressive controls, he wrote, provided that it not endanger respectability's power and dominance. This was so simply because, as he put it, the normative manners of respectability were essential for the creation of some kind of order, for the cohesion and functioning of society itself. The second example of his tensions and contradictions concern his analyses of and personal relation to nationalism in general and Jewish nationalism in particular. How did this work? At the same time in which he unmasked and critiqued the deep dangers of nationalism, he possessed a profound attachment to its blandishments. His school at Salem, he wrote, gave me a first taste of nationalism, which at the time I found congenial. There was a danger that it might provide a belief system that I so badly lacked. When as a historian much later I wrote about nationalism, I did have an insight into its truly seductive nature. Indeed, at the age of about 15, he watched a Nazi demonstration in front of his home in Berlin. The impression was so great, he later recalled, that I ran away from home, it must have been in 1932, and went to a Hitler rally. I must admit, even today, that it was an experience. I was swept away. First, there were masses of people. That was very captivating to be in the middle of it. But it was also Hitler. Strange. Nationalism, as he understood it, satisfied deep cravings for community, and he systematized these insights about the power of this new politics, what he called the secular religion. He loved to go with me to Masada, which he called the Jewish holy mountain. Each nationalism has its holy mountain. Monuments, flags, myths, and symbols, as he wrote in The Nationalization of the Masses. The same empathic duality, the same contradiction applied to Zionism and Israel. No one better demonstrated how Zionism embodied precisely those categories that he had critiqued. This new Zionist Jew, he wrote, so different to the ghetto Jew, beautiful, muscular, filled with, don't look to me. I'm just reporting. This new Zionist Jew, so different to the ghetto Jew, beautiful, muscular, filled with energy, actually represented a normalization, an assimilation to middle-class ideals and stereotypes. Yet he identified deeply with those very same myths, symbols, and stereotypes. As he candidly admitted, I was far from consistent. My own engagement in Israel told of the need for a more concrete embodiment of my Jewish identity. My accelerated heartbeat when I witnessed the swearing in of Israeli paratroopers on Masada, Israel's holy mountain, as he writes, reveals the attraction of an emotional commitment, even for one who prides himself on the use of his reason. Perhaps such a reaction is based upon the experience of anti-Semitism and its constant denial of Jewish manhood. However, once again, ideal and reality differ even within my own person. I remember my joy on my first visit when I saw sturdy, self-confident Jews, though this again was a stereotype. And he concluded, I myself was far from immune to the irrational forces, which as a historian I deplore, and especially when it came to that group which I regard as my own. Part of this affirmation, where one of its sources, he wrote elsewhere, a largely unstated appreciation of the need for organized force and collective self-defense in a very imperfect, murderous world. A corrective, perhaps, to the blind spot of the Bildungsintellectuals, who habitually misdiagnose brutal political realities and render them into culture. There was, he reflected, always a certain pull towards realism, to the feeling that if one did not belong to a strong nation, one could slide back into statelessness. I'm going to skip a bit here, we're running for time. So I want to say very briefly, not so much about his legacy and his influence, and I'm sure Vicky may mention this, his extraordinary influence in Italy, not in Germany, but in Italy. I want to talk less about that than the afterlife of his work. How does it stand in relation to some current, wider political, cultural developments? The first relates to masculinity and sexuality. In his image of man, George was certainly aware of significant positive developments, especially the erosion of the traditional masculine stereotype. I think he would have been absolutely delighted by many contemporary changes, the radical extent of which I do not think he foresaw, and which can be considered without doubt to be absolutely revolutionary. Within an unbelievably quick time, the constraints of sexual respectability have become remarkably relaxed. Gay marriage, even in his time, was kind of an unthinkable possibility. Not too long ago, the very idea of a grouping called LGBTQ would have been unrecognizable. Today, it's a kind of familiar, almost domesticated collective noun. And to the end of his life, George still felt it necessary to repeat. I think Andy was at that conference. He went on and on and on. Beware of normalcy, time and time again. But we've got to a point that in Israel, a few years ago, there's a group called Gvanim. And that group had a huge billboard in which it said, have the courage to be normal. So we're seeing here some kind of dialectic occurring. You know, it's like James Thurber's quip, must you be as nonconformist as everybody else? But he had no simplistic illusions about this matter. Whatever positive changes there were, it was difficult he maintained, to envision either the downfall or even an ultimate challenge to respectability and masculinity, because he believed to the end that it provided the cement for order and social cohesion. And so fundamentally, he even argued that many homosexuals continue to accept the ideal of masculinity and they accent their own masculinity. But most importantly, he foresaw that a clear reaction to these positive developments would set in a very deep reaction. Of that he was clear. And quite apart from the persistence of traditional homophobic attitudes in areas of non-Western world, the inevitable counter-movement in the West is underway. His analysis may help to account for the intensity of our present cultural wars, the extreme backlash against the LGBTQ phenomenon, and its perceived ever-growing threat to normalcy and sexuality. Again, it's a whole paragraph, so I'll just paraphrase it by saying, we are at the moment redefining outsiders and insiders. Some of the outsiders are now within the society. They're not outsiders. They're creating new outsiders within. And what I'm trying to argue here is that that dialectic continues, but in new form. And I will end with this on nationalism. He understood that nationalism satisfied both legitimate and deep longings of community and could not be wished away. The idea, therefore, was not to abolish, but rather humanize it, make it less aggressive, more inclusive. He even had in mind a model for that ideal, suggesting how can this be accomplished. He insisted upon a principal distinction between what he called patriotic and integral nationalism. Thus, he argued in 18th century Germany, the idea of friendship, which symbolized the autonomy of personal relations and the acceptance of individual differences, the free exercise of citizenship, coexisted with a sense of patriotism and national identification. Solidarity rather than domination prevailed. He argued it was only in the 19th century that integral nationalism arose with its controlling claims of totality that gave rise to a homogenized, ever-increasing conformity. And he took as his example this group of Central European Zionist intellectuals, Brit Shalom, Hans Kohn, Robert Welch, Hugo Bergman, Scholem, who formed Brit Shalom to create a kind of binational state. And he argued Jews were more able to become advocates of this alternative nationalism, which might keep its earlier promise. As late as 1986, he continued to believe that this alternative was a realistic one. I quote, that I have spent so much time investigating that nationalism, which has made the Jews one of its principal victims, does not mean that a nobler nationalism cannot exist. Indeed, it has existed in the past, based upon solidarity rather than aggression. Today, it seems almost forgotten that it was precisely these Zionists in Eastern and Western Europe who continued to desire this kind of nationalism, which is based on solidarity. Now, these are great sentiments, and as a great admirer of George, I identify with them. But very sadly, the present situation in parts of Europe and the United States, not to mention various Islamic and African countries, and especially now, Israel, does not provide much realism or hope of success to George's vision. Indeed, the 18th century patriotism and friendship and the free exercise of citizenship, which he spoke about, I think was really a very pale form of nationalism right from the beginning. I rather think it was doomed right from the beginning. Indeed, he started realizing this. He said, even amongst its most progressive early prophets, national liberation undermined democratic self-determination. And in any case, in the context of nationalism, what is meant by solidarity and self-determination? Solidarity for and against whom? Potentially, the very notion of self-determination may negate the self who is the other. At a different time, he expressed himself a certain skepticism. What does self-determination mean, he wrote? There are certain historical circumstances under which it is impossible or in which it leads to more conflicts than it solves. I wonder if today, however sadly, he would agree that his humanizing, expansive vision appears very dim and direct. We cannot know. So I'm just going to give 2 paragraphs and I'm going to do it quickly because I want to talk about George the Mensch, the man, as a person. It was his sheer overflowing humanity, so refreshingly different from the usual dry, run-of-the-mill academic that so shone out. It was apparent in his charismatic teaching, passionate, direct, engaging, engendering thought through often outrageous, but always illuminating assertions. He would have been absolutely appalled by the notion of safe spaces or trigger warnings that would hurt the sensitivities of students. The job was to provoke them. I think it was Sky this morning reminded me, one of his saying is that liberal education demands disagreement. And so teaching through provocation was his method. So as progressive as he was, in that sense, he would be deeply anti-PC in that sense. So everyone has their own George, and I'm going to end just with 1 or 2 last personal stories about George. No one but George could worry about squirrels laying eggs in his attic, which bothered him for months. Or who else could sell the Mosse Schenkendorf estate to, I'm not kidding, to a Romanian prince called Count Dracula? It's not serious, read the book. Those who knew him inevitably had their George stories. Mine began on the very first night I met him on a 1968 night at the time of the student revolution, when the University of Wisconsin was on political fire with demonstrations and disruptions. I knew immediately that he would be my teacher. When we said, George, how on earth can you teach like this? And he said, oh, Stephen, no student revolution begins before 2 in the afternoon. I teach at 10 in the morning.
Thank you so much for inviting me to comment, respond to Stephen's wonderful talk about George Mosse. When I was a graduate student at Columbia between 70 roughly and 76, and I studied with great European Jews, with Fritz Stern and with Arno Mayer, who was at that time teaching at Columbia, coming from Princeton. And I never heard the name of George Mosse. The Columbia department was constituted in a very, very different way, so that a figure like George Mosse, would have been very difficult to imagine. And, you know, at a certain point, we can work through, you know, some of the reasons why this should have been so. So my own acquaintance with George Mosse goes back to the mid-1970s on my own. It was a professional and intellectual connection, acquaintance, if you want, and personal in a very, very deep way, though I never met the man. So it was in 1976, I believe, just when I had finished my thesis, which was on fascist mass organizations with these cultural dimensions, that he wrote to me and asked me if I wanted to contribute an article on this thesis to his Journal of Contemporary History. And of course, I was just, oh my goodness, my luck, you know. And I set to work on it. And I smoked a lot in those days because, hey, Simone de Beauvoir smoked, Hannah Arendt smoked, and I smoked. And, you know, it was part of woman's self-regard, you know, as an intellectual. So I set in to do the article, and I smoked and I smoked and I smoked, and very little work was going on. Smoked and smoked and smoked and smoked and smoked another month. And, you know, about 3 months of smoking, I said, this is going nowhere. And I had to start teaching, and it's not happening. So I can imagine now, beginning my career. So I wrote to him and I said, school's about to begin and I haven't done it, and I don't think I can. And he wrote back and he said, oh, that happens. You know, it's maybe all for the best. So it was an extraordinary moment. I said, I've wasted 3 months, not done anything, humiliation, self-humiliation. And then I said, I think I can save this. I heard it takes 3 months when you stop smoking, you never get any work done. So I took the cigarettes and threw them into the attic space, and I stopped smoking. So I attribute that to George. But that was preceded actually by a strong intellectual connection I made in 1976 or 77, a year or so after he published The Nationalization of the Masses. And by that time, George Mosse had published a half dozen books, the first in 1950. I mean, Stephen has really given a strong sense of his trajectory here. A revision of his Harvard dissertation. He would write a half dozen more books before he died in early 1999. But he always regarded that book, The Nationalization of the Masses, as his breakthrough book, as special. And it was the first time, I believe, that he gave full voice to his notion of cultural history, which was something very new in the way he was presenting it at the time, and which was very different from what Columbia was very good at. Intellectual history, defined very differently, and Fritz Stern was part of that, or political history, different sort of bases. It was the first book to explore political symbols and the means of their diffusion. This book honed the acute anthropological sensibility that 2 decades later would culminate in Mosse's last major work, The Image of Man, his pioneering historical account of masculine stereotypes in modern Western culture. So why was I interested in it? The book's subject was about men. Specifically, it was about the gregarious, flag-waving, choral-singing, war shrine worshiping, male associational culture of 19th and early 20th century Germany. Where did these powerful, originally local movements of fraternity, playfulness, and aesthetics come from? That was one of his questions. How did they change after Germany became a nation state, then a magnificent empire? After it was defeated, it was defeated under the Weimar Republic. What was the premise for this inquiry was up front. Adolf Hitler, he argued, his seizure of power could never be understood, he contended, so long as historians treated Hitler as some sort of super Pied Piper of Hamelin, using his personal magic to captivate the masses on behalf of the forces of reaction. That Hitler was able to exploit the culture of the masses for the purposes of the Nazi Revolution. It was because he had been formed in the same deeply felt, lowbrow, and in time more and more racist Germanic culture, and because he truly believed, Hitler, that by turning its repertory of sites and symbols into a quasi-religion worshipped by the whole nation, he would bring about Germany's resurrection. Well, why was I so interested in it? Well, at the time, I was an assistant professor and just starting revisions on my own thesis on fascist Italy, which I had defended the year before. So we were all at that point, I was very interested in the masses. I mean, the classes, whatever they weren't working classes. But this was a big problem for the 70s, especially in view of various populist movements. They were the economically miserable, waged and salaried poor of fascist Italy. That's what I was doing. And I was dealing with a charismatic dictator, not Hitler. It was Benito Mussolini. He too a consummate organizer of masses, who in my thesis was set on corralling the people's every leisure time activity, from bocce games to tourist outings, into his famous dopo lavoro or after work organizations. To my great gratification, George Mosse opened his narrative by citing Mussolini. It was 1932. The Duce was at Palazzo Venezia being interviewed by the well-known German journalist Ernst Ludwig. And he was saying that any successful revolution knew to draw on old political forms, reinventing them for new purposes. To tell from my copy's cracked binding, creased cover, and page after page of notes, smudges, and underlining of this nationalization of the masses, I took Mosse's arguments very seriously. Indeed, it was one long wrangle between his liberal culturalist perspective and my Gramscian Marxist feminism over what he meant by nationalization. This is a question that comes up, his relationship to the nation and what he believes is nationalism is. And who were these masses? That was a term that we were getting very nervous about as radicals, to lump them all together and to see them in some ways being, trying through the French Revolution to create a revolution and then becoming seduced by themselves into worshiping themselves and then looking for leaders who would pander to that kind of self-worship. Why speak of political religion? And this is a question we might turn back to all of us. If politics and religion in the West were always contaminating one another, why set aside this notion, that there was some special symbolic logic? Why did he speak of civil society? I mean, there he was talking about all these people marching around civil society. Again, this is the grumbles of a young professor. When it was self-evident that the national chauvinist forces were rising through the milieu of civil society, only to be captured by reactionary forces empowered through their seizure of the levers of state power. And why no women? Okay. Weren't they signally present in these idealized male solidarities, even in their ostensible absence? No women. Okay. Now, not that any of these arguments kept me from feeling that I was in the company of a real, compagnon de route. That word comes up here and here, that there was something charming about this guy whom I didn't know and whose book I was reading. Now, from the Radical History grapevine, the Twitter feed of those days, students and untenured left professoriate, I knew George Mosse was a German Jewish emigre of prodigious culture and hard to pinpoint politically, which was not necessarily a plus in those fractious times. He was no fireman Marxist. I understood that from coffee with Andy Robbenbach, unlike his University of Wisconsin colleague, the French labor historian Harvey Goldberg, whom we did read at Columbia with social historians like Robert Paxson, nor was he an anti-establishment populist like the US foreign policy historian William Appleman Williams, whom we invited to the radical history groupings and lectures which we held in New York in those days. But whatever he was, his students revered him as a teacher and mentor, respected him for his equanimity in the face of anti-war protesters and flaming student polemicists, delighted in his seminars, soirees with sips of cognac, and thrived on the intense contact with European anti-fascist culture through the German workshops he supported. And they also registered approvingly, something that was so important at the time, his indifference to the suffocating heteronormativity of academic sociability. Oh, it was so. Professors and their wives, with its Donish womenizing husbands, officious wives, and cute, uncomplaining children. So this was a person who at a distance also was the state university, a public university, Wisconsin, that was radical. You know, this seemed like something really, really quite wonderful. Now, since we were all post-68 and we were all upset at one another, here I wanted to simply start to place him because that seemed very important to understanding in some ways his legacy and why he should be here at Columbia, okay, in this department. And, you know, an occasion, you know, going forward for really joyous and very wonderful sort of sociable talk, okay. It was an incredible time, the 1970s, when Mosse was making his swerve, let's say in the mid-70s. I think this book, Nationalization, was Mark the Beginning of a whole new trajectory for a professor. Lots of professors sort of stopped, you know, what they were doing and stayed doing what they were doing until they retired. He did not. He set off on a whole new direction. It was just the midpoint in his career, and things would happen then in those next years, which I think depended very much on his responses to the 1970s and a kind of liberation that he too felt with all of the political action that was taking place amongst the students and then in the culture generally. So to just think back to those times, really 70s, the revolution wasn't happening. And reforms, well, maybe they were happening, but it was the beginning of what my contemporary historians, young historians now call this great sort of neoliberal swerve. Okay, and nobody could get a grip on the so-called silent majority, which after embracing Richard Nixon in the 68 elections and electing him once more in 1972, only to see him impeached and quit, had given a grudging yes to the populist Democrat Jimmy Carter, only to embrace, oh dear, 4 years later, Ronald Reagan. We can go on. The 70s was mind-boggling. The more our historical studies sought to bring the state back to understand the power of big government, the more history suggested that reforms only made state power more capillary, fluidifying what Michel Foucault characterized at the time as the micropowers of governmentality, so that they circulated into everything from sex and the psychiatrist's couch to public assistance. We will ask in a moment or so about Mosse's relationship to Foucault and those ideas of normativity. It raises such interesting questions, I think, also for our students. The upside was that in this interregnum of the 1970s was a springtime for critical history, and indeed for the fierce debates between radicals and revisionists about what that meant. As American scholarship was internationalized with European historians of Europe, I should say, in the lead, it was God versus the devil as we wrangled over the diverse, often antagonistic schools of thought, all of which seemed a radical improvement over American empiricism, or worse, the scientific turn to econometrics and sociological modeling. There was a French influence on of the Annales school, structuralism, Louis Althusser, German critical theory, strong with some of you, Frankfurt School with Walter Benjamin and Jürgen Habermas, and there was British cultural Marxism, but especially the refined social and cultural history of Raymond Williams and E.P. Thompson. Okay, as history departments began a little bit to become more inclusive in terms of sheer numbers of graduate students and in growing numbers of women among them, with big state universities in the lead here. So the leads were places like Wisconsin or Rutgers or the University of California, Berkeley, UCLA, not at Columbia. We fed off of newsletters, conferences, and journals like Radical History Review, New German Critique, Thiele's Radical American Critical Theory. And there was a great deal of political wrangling, camaraderie, and bruised egos, but also a lot of intellectual satisfactions. All that made the nationalization of the masses, this book coming out in '76, even though it wasn't picked up by the professoriate, okay, especially the great, the intellectuals, the great German Jews who dominated the very strong German and other European, this very strong department. So it was a work that was like sui generis and captivating. Okay, he was writing cultural history, not history of ideas. Okay? Fritz Stern's book, for example, a beautiful book, The Politics of Cultural Despair, which has sympathies which are akin. He is writing about the failure of Bildung and of young male, brilliant young men to turn all their contempt on the culture. And so it was a very different, it wasn't a cultural history, though now we could sort of say, it's certainly different from the more traditional intellectual history as history of ideas. So it too was very new, but in a different way. His book exposed to a transcendent political questions. How did the nationalism of early 19th century liberal democracy, once regarded as a force for progress, opened the way to reactionary forces, culminating in Nazism and fascism? Okay. Why hadn't the socialist left been able to capture the resentments of the middle classes against industrial society? Could we speak of an authentic mass, working class, or popular culture, or were they inevitably corrupted by the powers that be? Why was it that liberal societies ended up being so cruel to individuals? These, I think, were the very big questions. Now, those are still questions that, as we heard also from Stephen's work, are very much present with us today. I think I want to, stop here with these, opening up these big questions, and hoping that they will continue to be addressed as in the conferences that, and I should say the annual or biannual, whatever conference or speech or presentation which will be taking place. But in so doing, I just want to thank, on behalf of Columbia and on behalf of historians, as well as the relations between the German department, which has a strong also historical interest for this. It's an unusual legacy. I have to say that, which has money in it. I mean, and that's a terribly interesting part of the story, this Mosse legacy. When I wrote about the Irresistible Empire, and one of the first names I came across when I was writing about advertising, sort of the pushback to American type advertising, was the Mosse agency, without connecting George Mosse to this agency. And of course, all of this immense wealth was expropriated. And after 1989, after 1990, the process of reappropriating it, which then is certainly very helpful in terms of getting his Mosse's books back, but also in kinds of wonderful programming that's been going on to revive historical research and historical thinking, and not just about Europe in any narrow way, but much more broadly, this kind of issues that I posed as identified. But I had questions that we might want to continue to discuss. I mean, it is a question how he understood normative behavior, and I found, and their male sexuality. I've had students of mine very recently, 2 years ago on COVID, God knows, read The Image of Man as part of a class on Men in Crisis, 1880 to, I tried to limit it, Men in Crisis, 1880 to 1940, reading, Buddenbrooks and so on and so forth. But a liberal idea, but it seems still narrow in some way. And I wanted you to think about that. In other words, he is sort of a deep belief in a bourgeois order, not dealing a lot with power, actually, and either individual power or he's assuming the power of opinion, power of the state, radically not connected to Foucault, and how others could speak to that. How is it that an historian who speaks of having dealt with interest in anthropological, interest in liturgical, what would be, how would it work that you would ignore that? Now, he wouldn't be the only one. I think that a lot of historians coming out of the German, particularly German world, I don't want to go, we're not paying attention to Foucault. He was coming very late and coming mainly through feminism. But it was a sort of a question if you set up this problems of normativity. Foucault is working exactly the same period. Works 76, 80. It's exactly the moment that Wisconsin, they must have been bringing in Foucault and Foucauldianism. So it was a question for those of you who are here, how a figure like Mosse, who has a big appetite, of cultural appetite, how is he working that new schools, to respond to new schools and to the kind of thinking that Foucault would have generated also for masculinity studies and for sexual studies?
Would you like to hear the talk again? I don't know what I'm doing with the microphone. To talk, then you have to sit here. Vicky, you can't. Okay. Okay. Very, very briefly, Vicky and I sat at a dinner table a few nights ago, and not what she said now, but a comment she made at the dinner table was extremely true, and I think one should mention this. George wrote history in which there are no stories, and that's something that Vicky pointed out, and that's correct. It's a more, I don't know if abstract is also not the word, but there are no stories, which is strange, because if you sat with George, on a personal level, all you would hear are stories. I mean, the best story I heard from George, for those of you who don't understand Hebrew, you will have to excuse me. He came to Israel maybe for 30 years. His Hebrew was not that of a great linguist. So every time he walked into a restaurant and spoke to the waiter, he would say, Adonai, meaning God. And he said, I would get great service. So he was full of stories, but his history was not storytelling. It was conceptual story, which brings us to your question about Foucault, which is interesting. First of all, you were right to say, I don't think George could have been Foucauldian or Foucault could have been Mossian, because George was essentially liberal and Foucault was not classically liberal. But more importantly than that, I know some disagree, George, although he read theory, wasn't really interested in theory, or put it this way, I don't know, maybe he was, but it's not apparent in his work. So his work would come out through understanding popular attitudes, norms, symbols, and so on. He would never resort to theory in a way that Foucault does. And I know that Sky pointed out, somebody has written an article in which Foucault and Mosse are compared, which I've forgotten the name of the person, but I do think that they read very differently. Although, as you say, there is a match of concern at that time.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I should have, of course, before I even hand the mic back to you, I should have said thank you both so very much for these wonderful, your lecture and your response to it. That was very, very rich. We did want to, I wanted to push the table away. That's why I handed it to you right away again. But we also, we did want to give you a moment to talk to each other if you would like to talk to. So I would hand the mic next to you again, and then we'll open it up to the audience in a bit.
It's more of a sensibility than a thorough reading, because I've frankly found Mosse difficult to read. And again, I ask myself, why is that? Why is that? Well, he doesn't use analytical categories, especially analytically. They're elusive categories, and that is the charm. I mean, nationalization of the masses, it's never defined. Never a second is it defined. I found it, it's a term I've come back to. I use it very differently from him, but there's this moment where regimes, US, Americanization is nationalization of the masses, the Americanization moment, but probably we could take the Reconstruction moment in the United States. You could simply see in Italy, the efforts late 19th century to bring the socialists into the state. Then fascism is considered to be. And he seemed to be, again, using this work as this, to have set up a comparison. Oh, it's not there. It's, it's something, it's sort of, it's like he's a companion. There's something about, he's companionable. He would not say, you're wrong, but nor is he offering a strict comparison. There's something about, now, what do these books like bring? This is also with the image of man, this immense culture, which is also a visual culture. I thought back to 1976, he's talking about, fascism and the beauty of it and how Hitler loves beauty. Of course, this is Susan Sontag is writing about fascinating fascism in 1974 and saying, let's be careful here. I mean, what's going on, it's the aesthetic problem. Well, he has this eye. He has all these photographs. We had no eye to go on then. Nobody had then Leni Riefenstahl's The Triumph of the Will, the film with, you saw a few minutes here and there. It was very dark and bleak. We had no visual images of fascism except the stuff that my father brought back from the war, the people arriving, at concentration camps and Buchenwald and, the bodies and stuff like that. But the richness of the pageantry, that would be coming quite a bit later, not to mention now we've got so much visual material. And so his writing, which is kind of ludic, it moves around, elusive often, requires almost a certain sophistication or a kind of readerliness. I mean, people, fine kind of readers of a certain age who are familiar, if you want, with the subject matters. I mean, this is again a sort of a personal response. So it's fascinating how much how well it's lasted. That's what I find very. I'm not sure who else is reading it. The books weren't even translated very widely. His work wasn't translated into German, though you said you were reading 85. So then it starts. So he's became much more popular in the 80s and then in the 90s, I think. And in fact, I think it's in the 90s that George's work starts to come together as an oeuvre, which is very illuminating. When a lot of the work on fascism was becoming more and more tedious and more typological and boring, his work, he's adding in sex, adding gender too. Even if it was no women, it was still, the worry about about masculinity was was fascinating because it had huge repercussions through the society. But anyway, let me.
You would like to open it up?
No, you
Yes, but you would like me to open it up rather? Yes. Okay. All right. So hereby I open it up. Do we have questions? Yes, please. I think you need the mic too for the sake of.
So Mosse wrote one of his later really great books, Fallen Soldiers, in 1990. And what also came out near them was Detlef Peukert's History of the Weimar. And a big difference between them was that Detlef Peukert barely referenced veterans during the interwar period, whereas, of course, fallen soldiers, almost all the credit is given to them. So what I'm wondering is, did living in North America, as opposed to the German academic scene, give him a different kind of leeway in writing about these issues? Or do you think that, yeah.
Now I'm handing it back.
You know, there are certain questions to which I don't have the answer. So I've never thought about that. In which way does the American context particularly influence that book? But I know post-fallen soldiers, what context he did discover, and which was interesting, which is now being disputed. But I won't get into that. And which he said he was very impressed with military cemeteries in Israel. And he was impressed because in Europe, generally, these were mass graves dying for state in a homogenized way, whereas commemoration in most of the military cemeteries in Israel were personal, were addressed to the particular soldier that died, and not just for king and country and the whole thing. But now we have a student, actually he was a doctoral student of mine. I should never have allowed that, because he's critiquing Mosse's thesis and he thinks that it's wrong. Ari Dubnov is right. So, but I cannot tell you how America specifically influenced that book. I mean, it's very interesting. George wasn't really an American. I mean, he never said Milwaukee. He would always say Milwaukee. That was George. So he was a German in America. And I think his foci, although he was dying, as my wife said always, he loved to attend democratic parties and get involved in the democratic process. But I think his focus almost always was on not even Eastern Europe, but Western Central Europe. So I don't know how to answer that question, how America influenced it. I don't know if you have.
This is such an outsider trying to figure out that it was hard to imagine that if he had stayed in Germany, he would have either gone into the firm, and he certainly wouldn't have become a professor. So that was a sense. In other words, he became, how he came into the university system in the United States. It was, being respectable. What is a German Jew? I mean, sort of how is he going to fashion a career? That's a very sort of off, using my imagination and not knowing deeply, but that he did at the university. Again, this is really secondhand. I'm not a biographer, and he studied, mainly with very high Harvard professoriate, doing constitutional law, English Reformation. That's very hard stuff in the United States. That's sort of the power historiography of the great universities, and you don't play around with that. You do your thesis, you write your first book, you write, continue work on the Reformation. At University of Idaho, then must have been a great thrill to get to Wisconsin. Iowa, I'm sorry, excuse me, Iowa. No, Iowa, okay, from Idaho, sorry. Apologies. And, I just thought, how would you live? The structures are so rigid. How do you, in some ways, but others can speak to that. I quite
Hi, Steve, I don't know if you remember Eric Santner. You used to beat me in tennis at the Institute Woods. Yeah. There was a question that came up partly in addressing the tension between Mosse and Foucault. And I think it has to do with the ambiguity of the word that's used so much, normativity. I mean, at some level, normativity can mean responsibility for your claims, answerability to counter arguments, norms of discourse, and rational argumentation. And clearly that has something to do with, I think, what the Enlightenment legacy that he clearly associated with a cultural formation, not reason, disembodied reason, but a cultural formation that made commitments to that kind of normativity. And then there's normativity in the sense of heteronormativity. That is much more what Foucault was interested in. And so we have this phenomenon, now in the United States, where people, completely ignore the normativity of, discursive practices like truth, facts, responsibility for consistency of your argument, respecting counter arguments, modifying your claims. And at the same time, with very rigid views of, normativity in the sense of normal behavior, the way people, ought to look. So you could have this, this weird tension between that seems to, haunt the word normativity. But the other, that's just a remark. But when you were talking about respectability and, middle-class respectability and Bildung, and we all, we are all, respectable, and we're not genocidal. But I mean, I think part of the, the larger critique of respectability is that, of course, at some level we're decent, but we're also participating in practices that are destroying the planet, basically, putting people in debt, slavery, digging, rare earth metals so we could use our phones. So in other words, our decency is, there's something also obscene about it. And so not genocide, it's clearly different, but there's the difference is sometimes, difficult to discern.
First of all, I think you're completely correct, but I also think that George would completely agree. And this flows from what Vicky said, that he never defined his terms. And that's, you said, is part of the problem, Vicky, and is also part of the charm. These are kind of rather large categories. I don't remember him ever using the term normativity. He used the word norms, and he kept on saying, beware of normalcy. Whereas he would accept the norms of Enlightenment rationality. So in that sense, you're completely right. And I think he would agree with what you have to say. In fact, I mean, he did put Bildung and respectability together, and saw that in respectability, or in what you call decency, that's the issue. because, you know, in fact, and he used words very interestingly. I mean, if he met a religious person, he would say, oh, he's very pious. Now, there's a subtle way of using the word. So what I'm trying to say is, I think that his very notion of respectability has critique in it. It's in it. So, you know, he would say, you know, what does it mean decent? The decency of the people who put Oscar Wilde in prison. They were the decent people. So I think he was utterly in agreement with you.
I want to speak to this issue of George and theory. He was very, how should I put it, bemused with theory. He had his students, many of his students worked from theory. Paul Brinus wrote on George Lukács. We had someone in our seminar who didn't become a historian, but who was an advocate of Wilhelm Reich. I wrote on Austro-Marxism. He was bemused by theory. But he wasn't theoretical himself, except once. He wrote an article early on, I think it was in the Journal of the History of Ideas, about myth and symbols. And that's where he picked up a lot of the ideas that he used in his books. It was anthropology that interested him, Boas and people like that. So I think that he had maybe an ambivalent relationship to theory. He was very proud of our New German critique interest in the Frankfurt School, but he wouldn't adopt it for himself. The other thing I wanted to say is just a comment. We all have our George stories, but you mentioned this night, you know, when you arrived on campus and the campus was in disarray and people were occupying buildings. I also came at that time, and the thing about George was, unlike other faculty members, he wasn't reserved. He didn't keep his distance from students. He was the only one who sat on the Wisconsin Terrace with a bunch of students. And in this particular instance, the students were screaming at each other over the question of whether or not their action, they were trying to kidnap the Dow Chemical Company recruiter, and they were saying they were Leninists. And George said, "You're not Leninists, you're Sorelians." I didn't know who Sorel was, but I thought it was a good idea that I should look him up.
Responses to this? No response.
You talk about masculinity, and you know, when watching Triumph of the Will, you see these grim-faced little kids, and you know, banging away on drums. But what I don't understand is the type of masculinity that I see on World War II documentaries, where German soldiers are in a theater, and they're relaxing, and they have their arms around each other, touching each other, swinging to a music or singing. And to me, that's the end, almost the antithesis of masculinity. So what I want, it would really help me to understand if you could explain to me what that is. Is that a relic of college fraternities, or is it a European thing? Is it a German thing? This touching of masculine flesh and going back like that, it's problematic to me.
I think it's part and parcel of what he was talking about, because he made he drew our attention to what in Germany were called Männerbünde. That is to say, groups of men who typically excluded women. If you read the memoirs of a lot of these people, the women were completely sidelined, and much of it was not homosexual, but a great deal of it was homoerotic. And the homoeroticism and masculinity are not contradictory. You know, the folding of arms and singing songs together. Singing songs together can be a very beautiful, but also a very militant activity. Soldiers sing often, you know, so I think that there isn't really a deep contradiction between the fact of men touching each other and putting their arms around each other and singing together, and the masculinity, which is the tough, aggressive kind. And I think he would think that. He was the first to draw my attention to the whole idea of what, you know, the Männerbund, the groups of men, which I don't know how much, if it applies today at all in America. But I belong to a Zionist youth movement in my guilty past. And the girls, as we used to call them, or even worse, Vicky, we used to call them dolls. The dolls were there, but the real activity and the real camaraderie was with men. And World War I camaraderie, obviously amongst the soldiers, was absolutely crucial. It was the glue that kept people together. So I think the two go in hand rather than excluding each other.
I think we are getting close to the end of our time. I'm just looking around one more time if there are, would either of you like to say any concluding words before we? No. Thank you so much again, both of you. This was wonderful.